I've come this morning having worked with this text. It's one of my favorites, and it's a good number of years ago now that I had the great privilege of tramping in the footsteps of St. Paul with Stan Lusick and a number of other clergy, and that provided me with an intense sense of pressure and experience on what it means to have lived in those times and to tramp in those places in that context. But it helped to inform me what it means in the 21st century to walk in these times in a different context and yet similar. It was tough days for Paul, and it's tough days for us. As I've been doing lots of thinking over the last number of years about all the complex questions that we have ahead of us as a Christian community, as Christian churches in the entire world, but in particular with Chalmers and with Sydenham Street, concerning things like downsizing and restructuring property and buildings, I have begun to have one guiding question. And so I want to invite you all this morning on my journey to this question so that it might become our question. But first, let me share with you this true story about a young man. His name is Neil, and he is a young computer scientist currently who arrived from London, England. And over the course of the last 4 years, he has taught at Stanford University as a specialist in artificial intelligence. What you need to know about Neil is he's a deeply committed Christian who's exploring what it might look like now to witness in the workplace among his unchurched 30-something friends. He described how he and his buddies back in London understood church in a different way. He says, "Forget church at 11 a.m. or 10:30 on Sunday mornings. Rather, meet your friends for sports and games on Sunday and then repair to the pub." I like the pub part. "Most people on their own terms," he says, "and at their own places is where you should gather with them, rather than expect them to come to your church." Now, young Neil sounded to me a lot like a modern-day version of Paul at the Areopagus. You see, the Areopagus was both a place and a group. In Luke's Acts of the Apostles this week, we find the Apostle Paul at the Areopagus in the legendary city of Athens. The Areopagus is the place, is a small rocky hill northwest of the Acropolis in Athens, translated from Greek for the hill of Ares, or in Latin, Mars Hill. And more importantly, it was the most prestigious and venerable council of elders in the history of Athens, so named because it met on that particular site. Dating back to the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, the Areopagus is considered of 9 archons, or chief magistrates, who guided the city-state away from the rule by a king to a rule by an oligarchy that laid the foundations for Greece's eventual democracy. Across centuries, the Areopagus changed so that by Paul's day, it was a place where matters of the criminal courts, law, philosophy, and politics were educated. At our worst, we Christians have isolated and insulated ourselves from the culture's mainstreams of the day. We can be inward-looking, self-absorbed, self-important, and cloistered, instead of engaging people at our own modern-day Mars Hills. Yet at our best, Christians like Neil have always been just as comfortable living, learning, and sharing the gospel in the marketplace of ideas as in the ministry of the church, in bars and in boardrooms, as well as in basilicas and universities, as in church fellowship halls. In an outward centrifugal movement modeled after Paul at the Areopagus, believers have welcomed the opportunity to meet real people where they really live, work, and think in order to gain a hearing for their strange ideas and understandings of repentance, rebirth, and resurrection. Paul's confidence for addressing a venue such as the Areopagus rested upon a twofold rationale. First, as he told King Agrippa after he was arrested and accused of insanity, "Your great learning is driving you mad." The message and the events of the gospel were not done in some corner, someplace. They are matters of historical record and open to public debate, discourse, and inquiry for all who call themselves honest seekers. In that sense, the Areopagus was the most natural and fitting of venues for the Apostle Paul. Second, as Paul preached to the Athenians, he believed that this one called God made the world and everything in it, and that every single person was God's offspring. So in his mind, there was no person, there was no sphere of influence outside of the Holy One's care or concern. All of the so-called secular life, and not just sacred realms, were spheres of God's loving presence, or at least potentially so. Law, literature, medicine, education, arts, business, government, science, quite literally everything and anything. What sort of reception did Paul receive at the Areopagus? Well, if you read early in the book of Acts, we read that the first Christians enjoyed the favor of all the people. But if you leaf through a few chapters later, you suddenly discover a raging mob of people who decided to stone Stephen to death and scattered the churches. I've always admired Luke's candor regarding Paul's reception among the Athenians. Some people sneered when they heard him speak about the resurrection. Others said, "I'll take a rain check," and asked to learn more at a later date. A polite put-off or honest interest, perhaps? And even a few believed, namely, that Dionysius, who was a member of the Areopagus, a woman named Damaris, and a number of others, were not to be listened to. Paul, who had been proclaiming this one known as Jesus' way, was ridiculed by these culture shapers and opinion makers as a babbler who advocated for foreign gods. Perhaps understandably so if you were some influential Athenian, and so they invited him to Athens, the most powerful and important venue to explain what they derided as his strange and, yes, wonderful ideas. Let me share with you this story of a fellow peer of mine in ministry. I find it informative for us in this time. He shares his trip as he and his daughter stepped into the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. He says that he wanted to return there to show his daughter the beauty of it all, the stained glass, the massive columns, the Keith Haring triptych. He had taken her as a child, but her memory of it, he thought, might be clouded. When they arrived after their long journey, they arrived and suddenly discovered that they would be charged $20 to get in. He says that he gladly paid and had planned to donate at least that amount, but he says, I knew that I would not have had such a positive reaction a few years ago. I had been to the church many other times as a modern-day pilgrim, but without having to pay any money, but with the burning need to see and be in a beautiful sanctuary that soared. He said, I wanted to breathe in the scent of burning prayers. I could imagine my resentment. Suddenly it's selling holy space. Yet, he says, I have been working with churches for a very long time, and I know the reality of it all too well. The building costs money to maintain, especially when they keep it open to the public on a regular basis. But he says most congregations struggle with this awkward dynamic. They want to focus on mission, but the building sucks up so much of their budget, and most of their energy pours into only maintenance. Even though the churches take up some of the most expensive real estate in the country, they have a difficult time keeping the lights on. And he says, I am sure that beautiful cathedral was no exception. He says, suddenly I discovered I was now a spiritual tourist, and I needed to do my part. Though I was not angry, there was a hiccup of pain. When we suddenly began to move about in the nave, we were immediately asked to leave parts of the cathedral. Security guards with velvet ropes began to herd us into certain areas, so we didn't get to see the triptych. A tinge of protest, he says, formed in his belly as he thought, but I paid for this. I felt, he said, like one of those bitter elders who doesn't get his way at a meeting, and so he brings up all of the money that he has given over the years. He says that he knew that his relationship with the space had changed, that he was now no longer a guest, thankful to my generous host for creating and maintaining the beauty for 125 years. But he says it's now become a transactional relationship where I was charged for a sticker, and so I expected certain things in return. That's the end of his experience. Modern day. It made me think about my ministry, more particularly over the more recent years across some of the churches I've been in Canada. And I've wondered, how can we faithfully shift when many of us feel like elderly widows knocking about in giant mansions, where the rooms used to be full of people, but now we know that our families are smaller, and maybe we need to downsize or be different. So how do we do it well? There are so many things for us to sort out. Is our building becoming a barrier to our mission? Or can our property become an asset and help us to further our ministries? Can we perhaps use our space in different ways? For instance, as an incubating space for nonprofits? Can we partner more with the immigrant community that we experience around us more and more and on a daily basis? As I think about our ministries, we have so many complex questions ahead of us concerning downsizing, restructuring property and buildings, etc. And as we sort it all out, I found that the more complex the questions become, the more we need one guiding question. And mine has become, what will make us, at the very least, better human beings? My prayer would be, may this become your guiding question as we now continue a journey as the followers of the Jesus way. May it be so for you. May it be so for me.